and welcome to Required Viewing, Trends and Current Events here at IPFW. This show is brought to you by the American Democracy Project as well as the Departments of History and Political Science at IPFW. It's being recorded by CATV and is also available through MDON at the Helmke Library. Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, and Ann Lifshitz will be introducing us.
The North Atlantic Treaty was signed on the 4th of April 1949, and it created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an intergovernmental military alliance for collective defense and very much a product of the Cold War. It was catalyzed by a strong desire to link Europe and North America in response to the Soviet threat. As far as its outcomes, by 1955, when West Germany was invited in, we see the creation of the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union, as a way to counterbalance NATO. So as far as NATO's achievements, it mollified European concerns about a potential German threat. It contributed to a greater sense of Western European unity and security. It provided a mechanism for the US to participate in European economic and military recovery. As a military alliance, though, it really did not have very much to do for its entire history if you don't count, numerous military exercises during that time. And then everything changed. The Berlin Wall fell in November of '89, Germany unified in October of 1990, the Warsaw Pact disbanded in April of 1991, and the Soviet Union, the main threat, collapsed in December of 1991. And so with the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, there were some very big questions raised about NATO's purpose and its goals. And our guest today is Associate Professor Jamie Toole from Political Science, and he is here to help us answer these very important questions about the NATO after 1991 and NATO in the present. So to jump in immediately, Jamie, how important was 1991?
Well, 1991 was very important because, of course, it marked the end of the Cold War. And, I mean, you can mark the end of the Cold War in 1989, in 1990, or 1991, but by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union no longer existed. So we date it to then. And when we're talking about NATO, of course, this is a vital turning point because, as you rightly noted, NATO was formed with a supremely Cold War objective in mind. NATO was created in order to counter the Soviet threat and to defend the security of Western Europe and North America from the Soviet threat. So once the Soviet threat disappeared, the new question emerged, which is, what is NATO's purpose?
Of course, it's very convenient that the NATO treaty didn't actually mention the Soviet Union. And so it simply talked about, the mutual defense and so on. And one of the things suggested was that, NATO could survive by continuing to serve its members' needs. Mm-hmm. So what were the needs of NATO members after 1991?
Well, that's really been, the big general discussion about NATO. And I guess the first thing we can say is that when an institution has outlived its usefulness, it's often very hard to get rid of it, and it's easier, or at least many people have a strong incentive to try to find a new use for it. And so NATO tried to find a new use for itself. And I would say that for most of the period between 1991 and the present, there's been a lot of disagreement about what NATO's purpose actually is. Now, I think in a broad sense, NATO has had a consistent argument throughout, and that is simply that it exists to protect the security of its member states, which really is not any different from what it was doing during the Cold War, except that the threat has changed. And the threat is no longer the Soviet Union, which disappeared in '91, or Russia, its successor. The threats are various. And we can get into that, if you like, as well, because NATO is increasingly focusing on what it likes to call new threats, given the war on terror and the terror threats that are faced, and other sorts of emerging threats, such as cyber war.
I would like to point out we have a couple of maps that we'll put up on the screen. The first map actually shows NATO during the Cold War, and then another map that we're going to show shows NATO as it's grown from 1949 to 2009. So the first map should be coming up in just a second here, showing NATO during the Cold War. There you see it.
I mean, it's nice. You can see obviously the red is the Warsaw Pact, and the blue is NATO, and you can see kind of the way that Europe was divided as a result of these two competing systems of alliances.
And the next map that will come up. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
Before we leave that, could I point out one or two things?
Sure.
It is interesting to see the red facing off against the blue, the Warsaw Pact against NATO. Also noteworthy are the countries in white. We have countries that are traditionally neutral, such as Sweden and Finland. Well, Sweden traditionally neutral, and Finland forced to be neutral by Cold War politics and a Soviet threat. We also have Yugoslavia, for example, not in either one because communist Yugoslavia, though communist, tried to forge an independent path.
And now coming up on the screen will be a map that shows the growth of NATO. This one's a little harder to see because of it's scaled down. They're showing a larger area. But people can see that NATO has not exactly been static. It has been growing over time, which in some respects addresses this issue of what are the issues, the threats to NATO.
That's right. And so we see a number of new members since the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, or by the end of the Cold War, NATO had 16 members. Now it has 28, so it's grown by 12. And we see some interesting patterns in the membership. One thing that we see, although it's not clear from this map necessarily, is that 21 of the 27 European Union states are members of NATO as well. So for most EU member states, NATO is their preeminent sort of alliance, and nothing within the European Union can match that. We also see some other unusual patterns in NATO membership. One is that there's the North Atlantic component, right? The United States and Canada are members, so this is by no means solely a European endeavor. And we also see Turkey, which is not a member of the European Union, for example. And of course, we see a number of post-communist European countries that have come in since then.
What do you, I mean, it's interesting because as we're trying to figure out how to redefine NATO after 1991, one of the big features, of course, is this expansion. Do you see the change in membership, and especially the inclusion of former Warsaw Pact countries, and the closer and closer movement of the border of NATO to the borders with Russia? Do you see that as fundamentally changing the structure, well, not just the obvious structure of NATO, but perhaps changing the ideological significance and the practical significance of NATO?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I would hesitate to draw too many large conclusions from that, but I would say that it's certainly caused a lot of practical problems, right? So as you well know, as a scholar of Soviet and Russian history, the enlargement of NATO into, for example, the Baltic states, formerly part of the Soviet Union, now part of the formerly rival NATO alliance, was a very big deal and to Russia, and angered Russia tremendously at the time, and still today, but tremendously at the time. It was somewhat less controversial to admit countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, etc., which had already made clear their desire to be away from the Soviet Union, had never been an integral part of the Soviet Union, but rather had been satellite states and allies in Eastern Europe, and were simply farther away from Russia itself, not bordering it. So you know, I think that it caused a number of practical difficulties in NATO's relationship with Russia. I would hesitate to draw too many broad conclusions from it. But I guess one other thing we could say is that any institution that's this much larger in terms of membership is going to become more unwieldy and is going to have a harder time reaching agreement on issues. So the simple increase in size from 16 in 91 to 28 today, that alone, regardless of the character of the new members, has caused some growing pains.
And of course, I mean, it's interesting, I mean, because this is where we might see, despite the enlargement, we see the continuity. The Soviet Union traditionally saw NATO as an attack on the Soviet Union, and we have a number of cartoons, though you can see sort of Soviet Union attacking NATO, and in particular focusing on the U.S. role in NATO and the fact that NATO is basically just a puppet of the United States and the violence that NATO brings along with it. And so the continuity now, and especially the expansion to the Baltics, is something that makes Russia very, very nervous.
And we have obviously a cartoon, anti-NATO cartoon from the Soviet Union.
It's hilarious. Get it? NATO's warhead. The United States is the puppet master.
Fortunately, you're here to help us get it so that we will laugh at it and find it as hilarious as you do. Next one coming up is another, this one not exactly complimentary. No. And we see the United States, increasing its military presence while it's climbing on the stairs. The stairs spell out the word NATO. Mm-hmm. And then the last one coming up, some might find a bit disconcerting. Describe this one for us.
Well, I believe it strongly implies that NATO, rather than a peacekeeping organization committed to security, is rather an organization that brings about violence and death and destruction along with it.
Jamie, how are those characterizations viewed by the members of NATO, especially those who've joined since 1991? I mean, does this have any resonance with anybody, these sorts of editorial cartoons?
Well, I mean, this is a big question in and of itself because it speaks to how much countries that were formerly communist have since moved on. And I think, without going into too much detail, I think they're conflicted about it. Most people in former communist countries have moved on. It's been 20 years, since these kinds of cartoons would bring up a certain nostalgia, but it wouldn't really hit home as clearly as it used to. At the time, certainly, these were very emotive and vibrant images.
Mm-hmm. The other, to change the subject just a little bit, although speaking of violence, one of the interesting things that we see with NATO is that during the it's a Cold War institution that was primarily dormant during the Cold War, not ideologically, but certainly in terms of practical action. And yet, it is actually after 1991 that we see NATO finally used as an interventionist force, in particular in Europe, and of course in particular in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. Where do you see NATO's role in the former Yugoslavia as part of NATO's growth or decline?
Well, the 1990s was a period of great change in world affairs. It was dominated by one country for the first time in a very long time. The United States was preeminent in the 1990s after Soviet power had declined precipitously. It was also an era of high hopes. Many of us remember a sort of talk of the peace dividend from the Cold War and of a new world order, which didn't have some of the ominous implications that it later came to have, but at that time it didn't. And so many people were optimistic about what could be done in the world. So the United Nations took on a much more active peacekeeping role in different parts of the world. And NATO became more robust and more active. Certainly, as you rightly pointed, it wasn't really active during the Cold War, but it played key roles in the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And I think what we can conclude from a look back at that era is that those ambitions, also led to a lot of mistakes. And so with the UN and its peacekeeping, we see terrible tragedies in Rwanda from a failure to act, in Yugoslavia from acting in the wrong ways, in Somalia, et cetera. So there were many failures because I think of overreaching and too much ambition in the 90s. And NATO perhaps did some of that too. And it was a way of finding its way and trying to determine exactly how forceful it should be, how assertive it should be, for example, in trying to defend human rights or in trying perhaps to promote the interests of its own member states. And I think we find in the decade afterward, and we'll come to that in a little while, that a lot of these lessons had been learned by then. But then in the 90s, some hard lessons had to be learned by both NATO and the UN.
Are any of those lessons, though, actually based, and it's a cruel word to use, but based on incompetence? In other words, they hadn't been a military organization other than a few exercises. To suddenly throw yourselves into that role, there's the question of strategically should you or shouldn't you be doing things, but then there's the question of actually execution.
Right.
Are they a capable military force?
Well, it's a great question. There are a few answers to that. One is absolutely. Absolutely. NATO is the preeminent military alliance in the world. Its members are the most powerful, and technologically advanced armed forces in the world. So if NATO wants to act and commits to act, it's very, very impressive. And nothing really is its equal. At the same time, NATO has had a lot of problems in terms of coordination and decision-making because the tradition in NATO is to decide by consensus, which means that any one member can overthrow the consensus or stand outside of consensus. And so, for example, in the NATO air attacks in the Kosovo War, there were all sorts of deliberations throughout the war among the many member states about literally like which building to attack on a given evening, when a normal armed force of a sovereign country would make that decision through a hierarchical chain and make the decision quickly and have it be effective. In NATO, it was a bunch of countries and their representatives sitting around arguing about what target to hit on a given evening, and it was very, very confusing and obviously not an efficient way to handle it. So, those are the kinds of lessons that NATO has tried to work through a streamlining of training and streamlining of decision-making. But no matter what, that kind of problem will persist in an alliance of 28 member states.
The problem with European democracies. Well, if we move on, since you already made a couple of references to the second decade since 1991, what about 9/11? It seems that that's a focus of ours. It seems to be a continued focus on our show. But within 24 hours of the attack on September 11, 2001, NATO invoked the alliance's Article 5, the guarantee that attack on one will be considered an attack on all. And this is the first time, right? I mean, this is a Cold War. This is a Cold War institution, and yet this is the first time that the Article 5 was actually invoked. Of course, then, when it came to actual participation of NATO, things got a little bit messy. How do you see NATO kind of rising up to the challenge of post 9/11 military engagements?
Well, it certainly is a challenge, and I think the place to start is with Article 5, as you mentioned. NATO is a collective security organization, so it's an organization that is specifically intended to protect any of its members in the event that any one of the members are attacked. And it is an irony that it was never invoked during the Cold War, although of course it was intended to be a Cold War provision. If West Germany were attacked by the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, this was supposed to invite all of the NATO members to defend West Germany. In the end, it was on September 11th, when NATO determined, after September 11th, that one of its members had been attacked and all the others would come to its aid. And it was kind of a moving moment if you followed NATO and international politics at that time. So anyway, it is an irony. But in terms of what NATO has been doing since September 11th, one of the most dramatic things that we have seen is that NATO has now moved out of area. So NATO is, of course, based in Europe and North America. The only countries that can join it under current provisions are European and North American countries. And it was always assumed that it would only act on that territory. But NATO has now been active in Afghanistan for a number of years. And as we all know, in recent months, it's been, of course, active in the war in Libya. So it's operated very much outside of its area, and that's a development that worries other great powers, for example, Russia and China, that don't want NATO to become too big for its britches and extend Western power toward them into areas that are of deep strategic concern to them. And it's had a number of other implications as well.
So when we're looking at that expansion outside, do you see a trend where NATO will use less and less obvious, quote, attacks on members as justification for intrusion elsewhere? And how big a danger is it? Do you think there are members among the 20-plus members who will say, yeah, no, we're getting too far afield here?
Well, that's certainly the concern among some non-members like Russia and China, right? That NATO will use its charge to defend the security of Europe and North America to begin, not just to begin, but to continue operating farther and farther afield, to use these as excuses for extending Western power. I think that most member states of NATO are not interested in doing so. In fact, if you look at the operations currently underway, one of NATO's big problems has been getting many of NATO's members to actually contribute. And we see, for example, in the war in Afghanistan, there's constant pressure from domestic publics in most NATO member states to pull their troops out of the NATO operation in Afghanistan or radically scale down participation. And we saw a real reluctance among many NATO member states to become active in the operation against Libya, too, although it has to be said that Britain and France played very robust roles in that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Libya because, on the one hand, there are obviously lots of different ways to interpret the situation in Libya. Certainly, we saw a number of editorials that emphasize that this is, the moment of triumph for NATO. That humanitarian intervention works. That for purely, for humanitarian reasons, a dictatorship has fallen. People are going to be hopefully, fingers crossed, better off. But there's a flip side to that, and that is, I mean, even though you have this more or less decisive moment for NATO to come together and act, one of the things that we saw as a result of the engagement in Libya is actually just how perhaps weak militarily NATO actually is. And again, leaving aside Britain and France, most of the other European countries did not actually keep up with the sort of technological developments in the battlefield. They're focused on their own, on borders that are not really under threat, and they don't actually have the capacity to do much. And even though, even though the challenge was not that great, a decrepit dictatorship is a decrepit dictatorship, and yet it took a lot to be able to actually kind of successfully navigate it. I mean, how does that bode for the future, especially if there are non-NATO countries like Russia and China, especially China, that are sort of eyeing NATO suspiciously, and yet NATO is not perhaps as strong as it likes to think it is?
Well, this is one of the great concerns among people at NATO and among some of the member states. There's a very interesting article that was recently published in Foreign Affairs magazine, and I think we'll be showing that as one of the suggested readings on NATO. It's by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who's the current Secretary General of NATO and a former Danish Prime Minister. And he argues that Europeans really need to restore their defense budgets and to bring back up their contributions to NATO. And if you look at the statistics, you see that American military spending as a proportion of NATO spending has been increasing, and European contributions have been decreasing. And that's not because our defense budget's been going up. It's because the European budgets, many of them have been coming down. And he argues forcefully in this piece that NATO needs to reassert itself militarily, because if it doesn't, then it's going to have less say within NATO. And the ultimate fear of many Europeans is that the U.S. won't take NATO seriously anymore and will basically, use this as an excuse to begin to withdraw from European affairs. And that certainly would weaken the collective security mandate behind NATO. And there are many Europeans who are beginning to really worry about this.
We do have about a minute left, and I got one last question is NATO actually necessary, given we have the European Union? I mean, will that eventually take over, so to speak, do you think?
If it does, it'll be a very long time from now. NATO is so much more capable. It has such a long experience, despite a number of the problems we talked about today. The EU is really in no position anytime soon to take over from NATO on security matters and military matters. So I think NATO actually does have a lot left to do. And the EU, as many of us know, the EU is concerned with a lot of other things right now, and it's not about to be increasing its military strategy anytime soon as it's trying to solve its economic crisis.
Sure.
Do you think that NATO has a role to play in the war against terrorism? Very quickly.
Well, it certainly has, and it probably will continue to do so. And I think that's probably all I have time to say, right?
That is.
And thank you so much for being here. But do we have time for him for Jamie to talk about his own project very, very quickly and the project he's been working on?
Yes, we do.
All right, good. Well, I'm writing a book that's actually not directly on NATO, but it's on U.S. foreign policy and what American citizens know about it and don't know about it, and what the implications of our knowledge or lack thereof, or what the implications are for U.S. foreign policy and for citizenship.
So we look forward to that, because perhaps we'll answer some of these questions that we did get a chance to address in the interview today.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back.
Accelerate your career with a master's degree from IPFW, Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, your graduate university.
Welcome back, and in case you found that topic very interesting, we have some recommended readings for you coming up on the screen right now. Several of them come from a journal known as Foreign Affairs, and so we highly recommend that you check that out. Among the items that you'd be looking for is an article by Brzezinski back in the September-October 09 edition of Foreign Affairs, as well as items from James Goldeiger from The Future of NATO, published by the Council on Foreign Relations, which also happens to publish Foreign Affairs. John Eikenberry's article in Foreign Affairs from May-June of 2010, The Future of the Liberal World Order. And of course, the North American Treaty Organization NATO Strategic Concept 2010. And then finally, an article that actually Jamie mentioned during the interview itself from Rasmussen, NATO After Libya, which appeared in the July-August edition of Foreign Affairs.
And NATO has its own homepage, www.nato.int, which also has a lot of really interesting information about at least the way NATO wants to be perceived during this particular period in time. In each episode of Required Viewing, we shine a spotlight on a faculty member at IPFW. This week, it's my pleasure to introduce our featured faculty spotlight on Professor Bernd Fischer. He's the chair of the Department of History. He's the author of way too many books that we can name, but you can see a couple of them here on the screen. He is also the recipient of multiple awards, again, too many that can be mentioned, the most recent of which he was the Distinguished Internal Lecturer for the College of Arts and Sciences last year. He's the Outstanding Researcher for IPFW this year, and he's the member of the Albanian Academy of Sciences.
Very good. Let's hear from Bernd.
Well, I'm actually involved in a number of research projects at this point, including a book for Cambridge University Press. They basically commissioned me to do one of the volumes in their series, Concise Histories. I'm also working on a longer-term project, which is basically a biography of the Albanian dictator Enver Hoxha. And I was just asked by the American Embassy in Tirana to put together a edited volume on American-Albanian relations. They wanted me to finish this in 2 weeks. I told them I'd get it to them by the end of the year. The one thing I'm really most excited about at this point is I'm putting together a document collection, which I hope to use as a teaching tool, principally in Albania. It deals with two specific lengthy documents, one German, one American, dealing with Albania between 1945 and 1946. And I think there's much to be learned from this, not only in terms of the material presented by people doing the work on the ground at the time, but also it essentially allows us to understand some of the pitfalls of working with documents. I mean, these documents, of course, like all works of history, are created by people who are fallible, people who have positions. And these two documents clearly demonstrate this, I think. The American document focuses on the fact that Albanians have this wonderful need for democracy, et cetera, et cetera. The person who put the document together doesn't really demonstrate this very well. The German document basically considers Albanians to be Southern Europeans in need of a great deal of help, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm hoping that this will help Albanians understand the nature of history and the use of documents.
And if that sounded interesting, Professor Fisher is going to be giving his Outstanding Research Award lecture on the 28th of October at 3 p.m. in Kettler, room 146. And the lecture's title is Stumbling Towards Democracy, The Case of Albania.
Should be interesting.
I think so. We usually try to end the show talking about some of the news stories that we are looking at that might have some really interesting consequences. One fun recent event is that in Saudi Arabia, women have been granted the right to vote, although they still do not have the right to drive cars.
So we have to hope that that polling place is close for them. We know that the Budget Supercommittee is doing its work right now. It's supposed to release its recommendations by Thanksgiving, but it really has to have those in by early November in order for the Congressional Budget Office to do its magic and figure out the true impacts. Even though they've been tight-lipped, I think they're going to start telling us some of that stuff behind the scenes kind of quickly.
So local news might be really, really interesting in the coming couple of months.
That's what I'm always hoping for.
Well, one other thing that we may want to keep an eye on is the recent developments in the UN, the request for new membership from Palestine, and the U.S. role in trying to figure out how that's going to go forward.
Mm-hmm. And my final one: everybody seems to think that Halloween is the second biggest retail holiday in the United States. It's actually not. Even though we're going to spend $5.8 billion, it's not. It's behind Mother's Day, Father's Day, and Valentine's Day, believe it or not. So that is it for this version of Required Viewing. Thank you very much for joining us. This show is brought to you by the American Democracy Project here at IPFW, as well as the Departments of Political Science and History. My name is Andrew Downs. My co-host is Ann Lifshiz. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to CATV for recording it, broadcasting it, and also to the library for making it available through MDON. Have a good afternoon.